Imagine you're standing right at the start of some massive complex project, or maybe just, trying to get your family through a really chaotic week. You've got goals, sure, you've got resources, but the path ahead, it feels like walking into a dense fog, right? Full of unexpected turns, unseen obstacles. You're constantly trying to make sense of the situation, solve problems as they pop up, and ultimately, well, get to where you want to be. Well, today we're taking a deep dive into some frameworks that can really help you cut through that fog. We're exploring strategic planning and problem-solving methodologies, specifically ones developed by the U.S. Army. And look, before you think this is only for generals plotting on maps, let me assure you, this stuff isn't just for battlefields. These ideas offer incredibly powerful insights into how you can approach pretty much any complex challenge, whether it's, I don't know, navigating a new market, overhauling an internal process, or even making a big personal decision. We've basically distilled the core wisdom from their official doctrines stuff on design methodology, planning, even how they think about, well, thinking itself.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these military doctrines, which people often see as super rigid, top down, they actually champion adaptability, critical thinking, and constant reevaluation. These aren't just rules written in stone, they're principles forged in environments where, frankly, mistakes have dire consequences, and that makes them incredibly valuable for any dynamic situation you might face.
Mm.
So our mission today, for you listening, is really to give you a shortcut, a curated set of mental models, some surprising insights that will hopefully equip you to navigate uncertainty and make, well, more informed decisions.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about frameworks specifically designed to bring some clarity to chaos. Think about that next big project at work, maybe launching a new product, or even just a tricky family discussion you need to have. The Army's approach, it really provides a serious roadmap for making sense of it all. So let's start with a foundational truth, maybe. Any complex operation, military or civilian, it's inherently dynamic, it's uncertain. Things rarely, if ever, go exactly as planned. And this isn't just about combat scenarios, it mirrors challenges we face every single day in complex organizations, unique market situations, or even just the constant back and forth within a team. The environment's always shifting under your feet.
Precisely. They actually have terms for it: chance and friction.
Hmm.
Those unexpected events, the inevitable miscommunications, the simple fact that things often take longer or are just plain harder than you anticipated. So, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it means planning isn't really about eliminating uncertainty. I mean, how could you? That's impossible. It's about developing a robust, um, a framework for action that allows you to operate effectively within that uncertainty.
Well,
How often do your own meticulously laid plans go off without a single hitch?
probably never.
Right. So this framework isn't about avoiding the unexpected. It's much more about being prepared for it. And what's interesting, too, is that this approach makes a pretty clear distinction between the art and the science of planning.
The art versus the science. Okay, tell us more about that.
Well, the science of planning, that involves all the measurable stuff, right? The analyzable aspects. Things like calculating timelines, assessing physical resources, using common terms and graphics so everyone's on the same page. It's the concrete data. But the art of planning, that's more about the conceptual understanding. It's about envisioning a desired future state. And then the creative development of the ways you might actually bring that future about. It's a more intuitive, leadership-driven aspect of crafting a vision. It can be far more nebulous, sure, but equally maybe even more critical.
I really like that distinction. Yeah, it's not just about the numbers and the spreadsheets. It's about the vision, the intuition. Which brings us nicely to two core planning methodologies they use. The first one is the Army Design Methodology, they call it ADM, and the second is the Military Decision-Making Process, or MDMP.
Right, so think of ADM as like your compass for finding true north when you're completely lost in a really dense forest. You don't even know which way is up. It's a methodology for applying critical and creative thinking specifically to understand, visualize, and describe unclear or ambiguous problems. We're talking about those situations where you don't even really know what the core problem is, let alone how to start solving it. This kind of raises an important question, doesn't it? How do you typically start when the problem itself isn't obvious? ADM is for those times when the end goal isn't crystal clear or a path forward just isn't self-evident at all. Think about launching a completely new product, maybe, where there's no market precedent, or tackling some vague organizational culture challenge where there's no predefined solution playbook.
Okay, so ADM is for the really messy, the truly undefined stuff. In contrast, MDMP, the military decision-making process, is described as a more iterative planning methodology. It's used to understand situations, develop a specific course of action, and produce a detailed operation plan or order, but for more structured problems. This is when you have a much clearer mission, maybe, and it's really about the detailed analysis and laying out the steps for execution. The key, though, is their relationship. ADM helps with that high-level conceptual planning. It helps you grasp the broad strokes and actually define the real problem you need to solve. Then, MDMP is what translates that big picture into detailed, executable plans. It's the how-to.
Exactly. And ADM can actually happen before, during, or even after MDMP kicks off. It depends on how much clarity you have about the situation as it evolves. They really work in tandem. It's not always this neat sequential thing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. These methodologies, they aren't just about checklists or following rigid steps ABC. They demand very specific ways of thinking. When I first started looking into this, I kind of assumed it was just about drawing lines on a map, military strategy. But what truly surprised me was how these frameworks demand a specific kind of thinking. They break it down into critical thinking and creative thinking. Critical thinking is defined as like purposeful, reflective thought. It's about questioning your own assumptions, evaluating evidence objectively, clarifying your goals to make sound judgments. It's asking, is this really true? Why do I believe it? What's the evidence? Creative thinking, on the other hand, that's about examining problems from fresh perspectives, developing innovative solutions, maybe combining old ideas in entirely new ways. It's asking, okay, what if we tried this? What else is possible here?
Absolutely. And these ways of thinking, they naturally extend into something called systems thinking. This is huge. Systems thinking is really about understanding how all the different parts of a system, any system, work together and influence each other as part of a greater whole. It means viewing any complex situation, whether it's an operational environment in the military sense, or maybe your personal finances or your team dynamics. Viewing it as interconnected, not just as a collection of isolated problems to be solved one by one. What's fascinating here, I think, is how this holistic view helps us understand that a system receives inputs from its environment, it adapts, and then it provides outputs back to its environment. Like imagine your company as a living system, right? How do different departments truly interact and influence each other's outcomes? It's never just one lever you're pulling in isolation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Then there's this other concept that really jumped out at me. Intellectual empathy. It's defined as imaginatively putting oneself in the place of others to genuinely understand them. And crucially, it requires recognizing our own egocentric tendency, our natural inclination to see things only from our own perspective. They even say it's about remembering a time when you were absolutely convinced you were right, only to find out later you were completely wrong. Yeah. That kind of humility is apparently key.
Oh, absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, intellectual empathy is really about the ability to accurately reconstruct the viewpoints and the reasoning of others, and to be able to reason from premises and ideas other than your own, even if you don't agree with them. This is just essential, isn't it? For negotiations, for team projects, for truly understanding your customers' actual needs, not just what you think they need. And these methodologies also heavily rely on open dialogue and collaboration. That's another core piece. Dialogue is seen as the catalyst for new thinking. It's about fostering an environment where ideas are shared openly, even those that might challenge established hierarchies or the status quo.
Right.
It's about creating a genuine learning environment where participants can think critically and creatively without fear of retribution. That's vital. This kind of frank discussion where diverse ideas can freely compete based on merit, it's seen as the antidote to, well, groupthink.
That makes perfect sense. You need that healthy debate. And speaking of different ways of thinking, these planning processes also rely on different modes of reasoning. They actually identify 3 core types that sort of underpin how we make sense of the world. First, there's deductive reasoning.
Right, deductive reasoning. That's about making an inference based on widely accepted facts or premises. It's classic logic, moving from the general to the specific. So, like, if you know that all senior managers have access to the executive lounge and Sarah is a senior manager, you can deductively reason that Sarah has access to the executive lounge. It's about certainty, provided your initial premises are actually true.
Okay, makes sense. Then there's inductive reasoning, which sounds like it's almost the opposite.
Yeah, in a way, inductive reasoning is about making an inference based on an observation, often from a limited sample, and then drawing a more general conclusion from that. You're moving from specific observations to broader generalizations. So if every single time you've presented a new idea to your team, they've immediately asked for more data, you might induce that your team, as a general rule, always needs more data before making decisions about probability, likelihood, not absolute certainty.
Got it. And finally, abductive reasoning, this one. It really feels like what a detective does in movies.
It absolutely does. That's a great analogy. Abductive reasoning is about forming the best possible explanation from the known information you have. Even if that conclusion is only probable, not definitively proven, it's about finding the simplest, most likely explanation for a set of observations. So if you arrive at work and find your office door slightly ajar, your laptop's open on the desk, and there's a half-empty coffee mug, you might abductively reason that your colleague, who you know is always an early bird, has already started working and maybe just stepped out for a second. It's the most plausible story.
Mm-hmm.
These different modes of reasoning, they're like the gears grinding behind the scenes in all problem solving.
Oh, yeah.
And just understanding them, being aware of them, helps you analyze your own thought processes.
Okay, so having explored these sort of mental frameworks and ways of thinking, how do the Army strategists actually begin to map out these really complex, often ambiguous situations? Well, ADM, that first methodology, it starts with something called framing. And framing isn't just about defining a problem in isolation. It involves developing this deep contextual understanding of what is going on and why. And also envisioning what the future operational environment should look like, your desired end state. It's like painting a complete picture of the whole messy situation around the problem, understanding all the moving parts, the history, the motivations of everyone involved, not just focusing on your own perspective. And crucially, this means actively considering the perspectives and worldviews of others. You have to try and see it through their eyes, too.
Yeah, and to help with this framing, ADM uses several tools,
Right.
which honestly can be incredibly useful in just about any setting, not just the military, things like brainstorming. But not just, throwing ideas out randomly, really digging in with divergent thinking, first letting all ideas flow without judgment, and then using convergent thinking, grouping those ideas, maybe using something like affinity mapping, to start finding themes and structure.
Okay.
Mind mapping, just visually depicting relationships between different variables or ideas. This can really help you see connections you might totally miss in a linear list or text. Researching. And this goes beyond just collecting data points. It's about determining what that data actually means in context, identifying the gaps in your knowledge, and continually refining your understanding. This isn't a one-and-done thing. It's very much an iterative process of learning and adjusting.
Yeah.
And narrative construction and visual modeling. Basically, building stories and diagrams to make sense of complex situations. These aren't just for presentations afterwards, they're cognitive tools themselves. They help you think through abstract concepts and can reveal hidden relationships or assumptions.
Okay, so you've done all that work to understand the environment, you visualize where you want to end up.
Right. Then the team shifts to framing the problems themselves. This means identifying those interrelated issues that may impede progress, what they sometimes call the system of problems. It really begs the question for you, doesn't it? What's actually preventing you from reaching your desired end state? What are the real blockers? This is your diagnostic phase, essentially. And here's a really critical insight they emphasize. Poorly framed problems are a significant danger. If the problem statement is too vague or maybe too broad or focuses on a symptom instead of the root cause, you inevitably end up with solutions that don't solve the real issues at hand. It's like a doctor giving you cough syrup when you actually have pneumonia. Get the diagnosis wrong and the treatment just won't work.
That's a great analogy. So once those complex problems are properly framed, diagnosed, if you will, then it's about developing the operational approach, which is essentially the commander's or the leader's visualization of how a sequence of actions will achieve that desired end state. It's your strategic narrative, your game plan for moving forward.
Exactly. And a really powerful concept they use here is the center of gravity. Now, this sounds like a very military term, but the idea is universal. It's defined as the source of power that provides moral or physical strength, freedom of action, or will to act. Just think about that. In any situation, what's the one thing that if you could significantly strengthen it if it's yours or weaken it if it's an opponent's, would fundamentally shift the entire situation? In business, it could be a company's brand loyalty, maybe a critical strategic alliance, a unique technological advantage they hold, or maybe even just the morale and commitment of your employees. What's fascinating here, too, is that the center of gravity is always linked directly to your objective. If your objective changes, guess what? Your center of gravity might change right along with it, so you have to keep reassessing it.
Okay, that's a powerful concept. So from there, you start considering the actual mechanisms you might use to affect change. They distinguish between defeat mechanisms and stability mechanisms. Defeat mechanisms, as the name suggests, are about applying direct pressure or force. Think of them as your sharpest, most direct tools for creating change. In a business context, this might look like directly outcompeting a rival on price, maybe disrupting their supply chain or aggressively acquiring a key technology they rely on.
Right. On the other hand, you have stability mechanisms. These are much more about affecting the broader environment, often through things like persuasion, support, building relationships, and establishing long-term peace or order. These might involve actions like providing humanitarian aid in a crisis zone or in business, maybe investing in community relations, building industry standards, or influencing policy. If we connect this to the bigger picture for us, it really highlights the need to choose the right levers for the right situation. You need a mix. Sometimes it calls for direct, maybe even aggressive action. Other times it's about persuasion, support, or fostering positive long-term relationships.
Right.
You also then link your objectives over time and space through what they call lines of effort or operations, basically ensuring everything you do is logically connected and driving towards that desired end state. And of course, any good planning always considers practical factors like the tempo of operations, how far your resources can reach, and especially managing risk.
Okay, so that gives us a good sense of ADM and the conceptual side. Now let's turn to the MDMP in practice. This is the more detailed nuts and bolts application of all that conceptual thinking from ADM, especially when you have a staff or a team to help you execute. It's described as a rigorous 7-step process designed to turn that big picture understanding into concrete executable plans.
Yeah, and while it's definitely a detailed military process, the underlying principles are, I think, universally applicable for anyone planning a complex initiative or project. The initial steps are really crucial. First, there's the initial assessment. This is where you very quickly determine the time and resources you actually have available. It's that critical reality check up front. Then comes mission analysis. This is where you meticulously break down the task. You identify specified tasks, what's explicitly asked of you, implied tasks, what needs to happen, but maybe wasn't stated directly, and most importantly, essential tasks, those absolute non-negotiables that must be executed successfully for the whole mission to succeed. This is also where you pin down your constraints, the limitations or restrictions you're operating under, and identify known facts while carefully developing necessary assumptions. And here's a really key takeaway on assumptions. They stress that assumptions must be logical, realistic, and considered likely to be true. Why? Because basing a plan on too many shaky assumptions can completely invalidate it later on when those assumptions prove false.
Right, that makes sense. Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. Risk management is also baked into this entire process, identifying risks, assessing their potential impact, and figuring out how to control or mitigate them right from the start and throughout.
And 2 critical outputs from the stage, I found these interesting, are CCIRs and EFIs. Commander's Critical Information Requirements, or CCIRs, are basically the specific pieces of information the decision maker absolutely needs in real time to make timely decisions during execution. Think of it as your boss saying, look, tell me immediately if X, Y, or Z happens because that changes everything. Then there are Essential Elements of Friendly Information, or EEFIs. These identify what critical information about your own plans or capabilities needs to be protected from your adversary or, your competition.
Oh.
From there, the team moves into course of action, COA development, and analysis. This sounds like where the real creative problem solving happens within the structure.
It is. It's essentially like wargaming your different options. Staffs develop and then refine multiple potential courses of action, or COAs. They work to make sure all available resources are synchronized effectively for each COA. They identify the specific risks associated with each option and look for opportunities that might arise. They use techniques that are basically structured simulations, thinking through action, reaction, counteraction, to test each COA against different scenarios and potential enemy or competitor moves.
Wow.
And then often they use something like a decision matrix to compare the refined COA side by side against key criteria, helping the commander or leader make the final choice.
Even if you don't have a formal staff, just going through these steps, mentally analyzing the mission, identifying assumptions, developing a couple of options, thinking through the risks, that outlines a really rigorous way to break down a complex problem and develop a truly robust plan for yourself or your team. Absolutely. But what's really crucial to remember, and they emphasize this constantly, is that planning isn't a one-and-done event. You don't just make the plan and file it away. Once a plan is actually in action, it requires continuous assessment and adaptation. You have to keep checking if it's working. You're constantly looking for variances, those differences between the actual situation unfolding on the ground and what you originally forecasted or planned for. And these variances, they aren't necessarily bad. They can represent either unexpected opportunities you can exploit or emerging threats you need to counter.
Exactly right. And based on those variances, you have what they call execution decisions. These are usually minor modifications, maybe implementing a planned contingency or a branch plan that you'd already thought about. Like, okay, situation B happened, so we switched to plan B. But then there are adjustment decisions. These are far more complex. They typically require modifying your ongoing course of action significantly because of a substantial unforeseen variance. Sometimes this might even lead to needing an entirely new plan. And this brings us to the really important concept of reframing.
Reframing. Okay, so this is when things are really going off the rails, maybe. Reframing is when you fundamentally question your original understanding and visualization of the whole operation. It happens if the current approach is clearly failing, or if the situation changes so significantly that your initial assumptions, the very foundation of your plan, are no longer valid. It's about engaging in what they call double loop learning. This isn't just fixing the symptoms, that's single loop. Double loop learning is about challenging and changing the underlying assumptions, beliefs, and goals that led to your original plan in the first place. So using a simple example, it's not just fixing a broken feature on your website. It's asking, wait, is this even the right website or the right strategy for engaging our customers anymore? And being prepared to potentially redesign the whole experience based on that deeper question.
Precisely. And to help with this, to make it less reactive, teams are encouraged to develop reframing indicators during the planning process. These are essentially predefined circumstances or triggers that act as tripwires. If these indicators pop up during execution, it signals a potential need to stop, step back, and seriously rethink the problem and the entire approach. This raises a really important question for anyone listening. How do you know when to stick with your plan, maybe just make minor tweaks, versus when you need to recognize that a complete pivot is required? That ability to pivot your strategy when needed is crucial for success in any field, but knowing when to do it and having the discipline and courage to actually act on that knowledge, well, that's the real challenge, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit more, because even with the best methodologies like ADM and MDMP, our own human thinking can unfortunately derail the entire process. A major factor here is our mindset, right? Which they define as essentially a set of assumptions and core beliefs that forms a lens through which we perceive the world. And often these operate completely subconsciously, shaping what information we even notice and how we interpret it without us realizing it.
Absolutely. And these mindsets often lead directly to cognitive biases, these unconscious patterns of thought or mental shortcuts that can systematically skew our judgment. And let's be clear, these aren't just military problems or things that affect commanders. They affect every single decision you make every day. Some common ones we probably all fall victim to sometimes include confirmation bias. This is huge. We instinctively seek out, pay attention to, and interpret information in a way that confirms the beliefs we already hold. It's why we tend to follow news sources or social media feeds that align with our existing views.
Right, echo chambers.
Exactly. Then there's status quo bias. This is giving unwarranted weight to information that justifies maintaining current conditions simply because we often prefer avoiding change, even if change is needed. It's that classic, but we've always done it this way argument.
Yeah, hear that one a lot.
We all do. Then there's sunk cost bias. This is a really powerful one. It's our tendency to try and recover unrecoverable costs. Time, money, effort from an earlier decision, even when it's clearly illogical to continue. It's that feeling of, look, I've invested so much into this project already, I can't quit now, even when all objective signs say it's failing and you should cut your losses.
In there.
Haven't we all? And maybe one more. Anchoring bias. This is where we over-rely on an initial piece of information, the anchor, when making subsequent judgments. The first price you hear for a car, for instance, can strongly anchor your perception of its value, even if other information comes later.
Wow, yeah, you can see how those could subtly undermine even the most rigorous planning process. And beyond these individual biases, there's a huge potential pitfall in group problem solving they warn about. Groupthink. This is that mode of thinking where people in a really cohesive group, maybe one with high morale or strong leadership, prioritize harmony or conformity over critical evaluation of alternatives. It often leads to rushed or poor decisions because no one wants to rock the boat.
Exactly. And to avoid groupthink, these methodologies specifically emphasize things like actively encouraging objections and doubts. Leaders are advised to refrain from expressing their own preferences too early in the process so they don't unduly influence the group, and they strongly advocate for using red teams. A red team is essentially like a designated devil's advocate team. Their specific job is to challenge the main planning group's assumptions, to poke holes in the plan, to consider alternative perspectives like How would an adversary react? How might a competitor respond? They force that critical challenge. What's fascinating here is just how deliberate these structures are to force critical challenge and diverse viewpoints into the process, even when, maybe especially when, it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Another related trap they mention is mirror imaging. This is the flawed assumption that others think or will act just like you do, when in reality, their motivations, their culture, their logic might be entirely different. Assuming your competitor values the same things you do can lead to big miscalculations.
Okay, so we've really journeyed through this sophisticated world of military planning today, and I think we've revealed some pretty universal truths about how to understand complex situations, how to frame problems effectively, develop solutions that are actually adaptive, and importantly, how to try and avoid those cognitive traps we all fall into. Hopefully, you've gained a clear understanding of things like the Army design methodology for ambiguity, the military decision-making process for more structured planning, and these critical thinking frameworks that can really elevate your strategic approach in pretty much any aspect of your life. We started with this idea of planning in a deeply uncertain world, didn't we? And I think what we found is that the best plans aren't these rigid, detailed scripts that are bound to fail at first contact with reality. Instead, they're flexible frameworks built on a foundation of critical thought, intellectual empathy, and a really deep understanding of the human element, including our own biases and limitations.
That's right. And this really raises an important question for you listening right now. How will you apply some of these principles to your next challenge? Whether it's deliberately taking time to frame a truly ambiguous problem before jumping to solutions, or consciously trying to understand competing narratives and perspectives, or maybe just simply trying to recognize your own potential cognitive biases before they steer you wrong. These insights, I think, offer a potentially powerful advantage. Because maybe the most effective plans aren't just about knowing what to do next. They're about truly understanding why things are happening the way they are. And, crucially, continuously questioning if your understanding is still valid as the situation evolves. In a world that's defined by constant change, maybe true mastery lies less in having the perfect plan and more in the ability to reframe, adapt, and learn again and again.